Today we are checking out 10 of the best arcade sequels that never actually got designs for the arcade. These games went straight to consoles and home computers at the time. There are some truly baffling games in this list, which will make you think, how did this not become an arcade game at all? I would likely argue that when some of these were released, the arcade was dying out, and so it wouldn't be profitable. But having said that, many of these games were released in the early to mid 1990s, and so of course arcades were still in full swing at the time with games such as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or even a Simpsons arcade game. So that really makes no sense at all. We even have games in this list which were so great and so well received at the time that they generated subsequent games that also released straight to home console or home computer. Anyways, if you've been watching my arcade ports series, in which I'll leave the link for the playlist in the comments section of this video, you might find this one fairly interesting, and there likely will be one or two sequels here that you naturally assumed were actually arcade games originally. You might also find a game or two you haven't seen or played before. Today we are checking out 10 arcade game sequels that never had an arcade release. The original IREM arcade release of R-Type released in 1987. 1989 brought us the arcade sequel. Later came an exclusive sequel known as R-Type 3, The Third Lightning. Firstly, releasing in Japan during 1993, then releasing for America and Europe in 1994. Tamtex developed this game for IREM, who then went on to release it. Of course, this is R-Type, the same layout and roughly the same gameplay with flashy neon lasers. And it is awesome, just truly awesome. This was the first game in the franchise to allow us to play as different forces. That's the Shadow Force and the Cyclone Force. Third Lightning refined the weapon system. This can be seen when we charge the cannon and let go of the button. That beam burst is awesome. It will likely wipe everything out as it travels across the screen in that colourful 16-bit glory. Never before had charging a beam look so good. We also got a 2-player mode with this game, and it was praised fairly well on its release. Many will go as far to say it's one of the best games of all time. It's an absolute welcome release which modernised R-Type for that generation and brought it into the 1990s with enhanced visuals, enhanced music and enhanced sound effects. Don't be fooled though, R-Type Third Lightning can be a challenging game regardless, and although it contains all of these major upgrades and enhancements, the core gameplay is still at heart here. Actually considered as a semi-sequel or even remake of the classic 1989 TAD Corporation arcade game Toki, Toki Going Apespit is very different in many ways to the original game, and this is the only version of this game, making it a Mega Drive or Sega Genesis exclusive. A few systems had direct arcade conversions, such as the Atari ST, the Commodore 64, and also the Commodore Amiga. The ZX Spectrum and Amstrad CPC were also said to have versions too, but they never actually materialized. Although much later on, these two systems had a few homebrew releases that were great. The Atari Lynx and NES also had conversions which copied the source material, so even by going by the subtitle for this release, Going Apespit, this implied that this was different, and it was very different. The game was developed by Sega and seen a release for it in 1992. Another game I used to play back in the day, and I thought it was wonderful at the time. The first thing that you will notice is that the layout of the game is very different. For example, the first level of the first stage doesn't have Toki climbing up any vines or even shooting down the apes controlling that massive block which rotates up and down, also known as the Stark's machine. Instead, with this version, this is actually the first boss of the game instead. It sounds great. In fact, it retains the Toki music and sound effects. The Japanese release of this game was also different in several ways from the Western releases. Tokigo and 8-Bit features 9 stages, each comprising of a few levels and an end boss, which makes this game much more lengthier than the original arcade game too. It's a superb Mega Drive and Genesis exclusive and features some of the best parallax scrolling for the platforms. We even get an options screen here where we can change lives and continues. Some argued in its day that it was far too different to the 1989 TAD game, but let's remember it was never intended to be a 16-bit duplicate of the arcade game. Shinobi was one of those arcades games from 1987 that was so loved back then that it actually got a sequel known as Shadow Dancer in 1989, to which today is still divided in opinion. The Mega Drive or Sega Genesis didn't originally have a version of Shinobi, although it had its own version of Shadow Dancer which was very different. And then came along the Revenge of Shinobi, also known as the Super Shinobi in Japan. This was never actually an arcade game and it was an exclusive at the time for a Sega 16-bit console, also being on the Sega Mega CD2 a little later on, that is, where it was included in a collection of arcade games. There was also a MechTech coin-operated version eventually too after this release. Revenge of Shinobi is considered a sequel to the original game and it went down in history as being one of the best Mega Drive games of all time. Certainly a classic which is often praised for its gameplay and awesome soundtrack by Yuzo Koshiro. It's amazing that all of these years later I still even remember how to activate the cheat for unlimited shurikens. A standard bit of knowledge that most kids had with this game at the time. It became the go-to thing before starting the game itself. One of the very cool features with this straight-to-console sequel is the simplicity of selecting ninjutsu powers. Just press start and press left or right on D-pad to select an ability. Go back into the game and the magic happens. There are also forms of ninjutsu 100% required for this game. Jump into platforms that are too high to jump, and so using ninjutsu is required for things like this. The game itself has very slight puzzle elements to it sometimes. Although it deviates in several ways from the original arcade game, there is no doubt about it, this game is just superb. I used to play this game religiously back then, both on its standalone cartridge as well as owning it on the Mega Games 2 cartridge, which most kids seem to have a copy of back then. Is this even better than the arcade original game? That's a tough choice, they are both equally awesome games in their own right.
Real Racing Roots 99 in...
Ridge Racer Type 4 was a straight-to-console game, specifically and only for the PlayStation. This Namco release came out in 1999 and gave the Ridge Racer experience much more depth with this game rather than its typical race formula that Ridge Racer 1 and 2 had, as well as Rave Racer had for arcades at the time. Of course, PlayStation also had other Ridge Racer exclusives with Ridge Racer Revolution and also Rage Racer, which were very similar to the arcade games. This game added so much more than everything else. It takes the arcade game and expands on it massively with new gameplay options such as the Real Racing Roots 99 Grand Prix, which comprises of 4 teams which also came with sponsorships that the player could join. Each team even came with its own story. This game even included a manager that interacts with you throughout the game. I'll be honest, I wasn't too keen on this game when it released, and it is likely because it was very modern or different from the previous Ridge Racer games, and it kind of seemed a little too much at the time. I am still very much like it today. I do expect to press start button and start racing immediately with racing games, but that didn't quite happen here with Ridge Racer Type 4. These new features baffled me at the time. Today I have appreciated it as I can see it for being a huge stepping stone in the evolution of racing games to what they have become today. Games like Forza owes a lot to games like this one. Very likely the most glorious arcade game, or game in general for its time, Splatterhouse released in arcades originally in 1988 by Namco. Scenes that look like something from a Cannibal Corpse album cover, with creatures spewing green liquid and monsters bursting out of stomachs, is nothing out of the ordinary for Splatterhouse. Eventually, when this game came to consoles with its sequels, it would have warnings on the box art, which was kind of funny in its own right. One stated, "The horrifying theme of this game may be inappropriate for young children and cowards." After a fairly good success for its arcade release, sequels then appeared on consoles rather than appearing in arcades. The first sequel was a parody sequel known as Splatterhouse Wampaku Graffiti, which was technically the sequel but also a spin-off of the original game. The sequel that most people will remember was titled simply as Splatterhouse 2, which released in 1992. It follows the same horror theme style and remains a challenging game to play. Pick up machetes, blocks of wood and smash the undead against walls whilst listening to its dreary music playing in the background. The game is based around saving Jennifer as you reprise your role as playing Rick wearing a terror mask. It's not for everybody, but definitely had its cult following. There is also Splatterhouse 3, which released a year later after this release. Again, a non-arcade release, although I think most would prefer this game, but by far it was still leap years ahead of that trashy 2010 remake. Did you know that regardless of the huge success of Bubble Bobble and its sequel, Rainbow Islands, Parasol Stars, the story of Bubble Bobble 3 was a straight-to-console and computer release only? Oddly enough, the game itself was of course as arcade in style as it was with its predecessors. Parasol Stars first released for the PC Engine back in 1991, and afterwards other platforms received a version of this game. The Amiga, Atari ST, Nintendo NES, and Game Boy versions were produced by Ocean Software and published exclusively in Europe for 1992. A ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64 version were planned at the time, but they never actually happened. Very strange. I remember seeing Parasol Stars being advertised in Commodore Format magazine at the time, as it was almost suggesting the C64 was getting a version of it. But magazines back then made many mistakes. One massive mistake was a game called Fuzzball, which had a demo for the C64, but never got a full release, which was very annoying. Parasol Stars itself, I think, is a seriously underrated fusion of both Bubble Bobble mixed with Rainbow Islands. The gameplay and layout is almost the same as Bubble Bobble in terms of being a single screen game and flying to the next round once enemies have been destroyed. It also borrows the human form from Rainbow Islands. Combining both of these elements work really well. It's a colourful game and at times very tricky, more trickier than it actually looks. The umbrella can be used to help us in Parasol Stars, such as when water bounces on it, we can actually fling the water off to take down enemies that you cannot reach. It's one of those games that had a big fuss of at the time and then kind of got totally forgotten about. Since its initial releases, it has had more recent ports for, say, the PlayStation 5 or Nintendo Switch, to name a couple, which all released in 2024. If you were unaware of this game, then I seriously urge you to play this one. Known as Return of Double Dragon in Japan and Super Double Dragon for the rest of the world, this was the fourth game in the Double Dragon series that never had an arcade release. It was also considered as a remake of the original 1987 Tecmos arcade game. It is argued that the Japanese release titled Return of Double Dragon was much superior than the version released outside from Trade West. Personally, I had Super Double Dragon for Christmas around 1994 with my Street Fighter 2 Turbo SNES pack and was chuffed to bits with it. A close analysis of both releases of this game do have little bits and pieces which are considered superior for the Japanese release, such as including an options menu and apparently better sound effects too. I personally prefer the Trade West European and American release, likely nostalgia for the music, as the Japanese music is different here. Thankfully, after After Double Dragon 3 in many ways being a big letdown, this sequel made up for it in many ways. Although it only released for the Super Nintendo and the Super Famicom, it's likely one of the best 16-bit Nintendo beat-em-ups around. What makes this so great is that not only does it go back to the original roots of what made Double Dragon so great in the first place, but it also expands on it by adding new moves such as the block, where we can block enemies' punches and then grapple them and hit them without them escaping. The generic backdrops are there, such as the forest and airport, but everything here looks so nice, and even includes a really cool moving truck stage later on in the game. There are 7 stages in total with bosses to fight. It is also the first game in the series that gives Billy and Jimmy a different look than generally looking the same in the previous installments. Here, both characters are seen to have different haircuts, and each player features a different fighting ability, a true timeless classic that you must play. With the huge success of the original Golden Axe game by Sega that released in arcade store in 1989, oddly enough, there wasn't an actual arcade sequel at all up until 1992, which was Golden Axe: The Revenge of Death Adder. This Mega Drive and Genesis exclusive released in 1991, which is very different to Revenge of Death Adder. There was also a third Golden Axe game that released in Japan, which was also a game in the franchise that wasn't an arcade game at all. But Golden Axe 2 specifically was the best in my opinion. It refines the controls in sprite movements and generally looks better than the original Mega Drive game. It contains 2 modes too, the normal mode, which is the main story modes where we can choose to play as the original 3 characters of the original game, that's Axe Battler, Tyrus and Julius Thunderhead. This mode alone is bigger and better in my opinion. It just feels and looks much more substantial in every way. It tends to run faster than the original game too. We also have the duel modes where we can kill enemies in multiple rounds. The premise of the game is still here, that almost Dungeons and Dragons style theme. It also contains a massive 7 stages too. As great as this game is, I still think to date that the pink skeletons that make a human sound when dying sounds a little bit strange. But literally, that would be my only criticism of this masterpiece. Yes, it is Space Invaders, and yes, this game has been done to death over the past 40 plus years, but this particular release, just titled as Space Invaders X, wasn't an arcade release oddly enough. By searching every Space Invaders sequel, each one was generally released as an arcade cabinet. This edition released on many platforms in 1999, such as the PlayStation 2, Game Boy Color, and this version you can see being played, which is of course the N64 version. It's clearly an attempt to modernise a fairly exhausted looking game, which even in 1999 was absolutely done to death. And they still keep coming to date here in 2025. If you like Space Invaders and have never played this version, it is a particularly good one, but just remember, there is only so much you can implement in Space Invaders without ruining the original idea. Now, I actually covered Rolling Thunder recently in my arcade port series. Of course, a highly popular arcade game originally, and so for its sequel too. We then move on to another sequel, which is Rolling Thunder 3, which is actually a North American exclusive, and also a Sega Genesis exclusive too. Of course, we have more of the same Shinobi-style action here, and that's not a bad thing. Rolling Thunder started off as a fairly basic-looking game, but here in the 1993 Namco game, it is suddenly looking more of its time, and nicer-looking visuals and awesome gameplay too. With this sequel came a brand new way to play Rolling Thunder. Before mission start, we can actually select a weapon to start the level with, and this ranges from shotguns to grenade launchers and much more. Something else here, which was a welcome element to the series, was having a little more health, which means that you can take more hits than the previous two games. Likely because we have now switched to a new character named Jay, and we are no longer playing the game as the previous two characters. I am really baffled why this game never made it to the arcade or even Europe, come to think of it, for its release. It's a fantastic game and likely is my favourite out of the entire trilogy. We even have fairly fast-paced vehicle stages here too in this game. The whole presentation of Rolling Thunder is much more laid out in a cinematic way with some nicely animated cutscenes which provides us with the storyline. It's truly got some awesome and very much welcomed additions to this final release of the trilogy. Most people outside of North America likely has never played this game when it released originally. In fact, I don't think this game is talked about much at all really. If you are concerned about the difficulty level being as bad as the first two games, this one, although still tough, has been actually toned down in that department. And that's it for today's video, and of course there's plenty of more games which I've not mentioned in this video, but I will be releasing a part 2 fairly soon, I'd imagine. But anyways, drop us a comment as always and let us know about your memories of playing some of these classics back in the day. Anyways, until next video comes along, thanks for watching.
Hey!